Welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for braving this strange spring weather and coming to our Sunday lecture. My name is Kelly Bartlett. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Ethan Allen Homestead. And I just want to give a few thank yous, do some introductions, make some announcements before we get started. So first of all, thank you to our sponsors, Richard and Linda Smarg, for our community enrichment programs, for our lectures, which you're enjoying today, for our field trips, and for our reenactments. As you all know, we are a small 501c3 nonprofit, so this support is absolutely essential. And with that being said, we are still looking for donors for the 2026 season. We're looking for sponsors, for donations. So if any of you are interested, please come find myself or Angie afterwards, and we'd be grateful to partner with you. I also want to thank CCTV and specifically you, Charlie, thank you so much for recording our monthly lectures, which you can then find on our YouTube page and on their website. And I'd also like to thank Margaret for doing the refreshments this month. So thank you, Margaret. Yes. And just a few announcements to make. So rapidly coming up is our opening day. That's May 1st. Just as a reminder, we're open from 10 to 4 with 4 tours of the historic house each day. So I hope to see you there. May 10th is Green Mountain Boys Day, which is free admission. Please come by. And we also have a big weekend coming up towards the end of May. So our next monthly lecture will be on Sunday, May 24th. Local historian will be coming, and he will be speaking about William Marsh, patriot, loyalist, and Vermonter. And also that weekend will be our first reenactment of the year. So Saturday, May 23rd and May 24th from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. we'll be having a reenactment. And just as a note about that, all of our reenactments for the year are going to be free in celebration of the semi-quincentennial, which is the 250th anniversary of our nation. Please come by for that. And just as an additional note about that, our reenactments are supported in part by Vermont Humanities. Now, one special announcement that I have to make is the introduction of our new weekend manager, Emery. Emery, can you wave or say hi? Emery, we're so happy that you're here. Emery is a senior at UVM studying anthropology, and they will be our weekend manager this summer. They grew up in Denver, Colorado, and moved to Burlington to attend UVM. While there, they served as an undergraduate writing center tutor, completed internships at the Fleming Museum of Art and the Heritage Winooski Mill Museum. And they attended an archaeological field school in Belize. That's wonderful. During their free time, Emery enjoys skiing and hiking in the mountains. So Emery, we're grateful that you're here, and I hope that you say hello to Emery when you're coming here on tours. Now, on to our speaker. Angie Grove is the executive director of the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum in Burlington, Vermont, since 2022. Angie grew up in Washington State and moved across the country 20 years ago to pursue her passion for history. Angie studied philosophy at Randolph-Macon Women's College in Virginia, earned her master's in history at UVM with a focus on Vermont during the Revolutionary War, and in addition to her experience in history museums, Angie has also taught in both the public and nonprofit education sphere. And as you all know, Angie has dedicated her heart, her soul, her time to this place and has made it a really special place to be. Angie lives in the north end of Burlington, and when not at home, she is usually on an outdoor or traveling adventure, which if you subscribe to our monthly Homestead Happenings newsletter, you can get updates on what she's up to. You can do that on our website. Okay, so without any further ado, here's Angie Grove.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Kelly. Thank you, everyone, for being here in a kind of dismal weather day. Perfect day for an indoor activity, though, right? Yeah. Okay. So I am going to have my phone here to keep time, because I don't know if you've ever met a historian, but we could go on for a while if you don't rein us in a little bit. Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting Remember Martha Powell and Be More Generous and Favorable to Her Than Your Ancestors. Maybe that quote sounds familiar, because 250 years ago, on March 31st, 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John Adams, who was in Philadelphia as a representative of the Second Continental Congress, and she wrote, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And in the new code of laws, I desire you would remember the ladies. Be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Right? Did that work out? Unfortunately, women were not remembered, were not granted equal rights by the Congress in 1776, nor have been remembered in the historical records of that time. One such woman who is not remembered was Martha Winslow Powell. Martha was the first British American settler in Burlington, a title that she shares with her husband and her son. And when Martha's family sold their Burlington land, they wrote the very first land deed that recognized the new independent state of Vermont. These are some major firsts for anybody to hold. Her husband has gotten all the credit up to this point, but Martha was there and deserves these titles as well. Martha served the patriot cause in the Revolution and in the fight for an independent Vermont state, and she suffered violently for it. In today's presentation, I will share what I have found so far of Martha's story and also share some tips on researching women in the 18th century. But I will first introduce myself a little bit more and talk about how I got started with this project. So my name is Angie Grove. I grew up in Washington State. I moved to the East Coast right after graduating high school so that I could become a Revolutionary War historian. Living the dream. I attended undergraduate college in Virginia. I worked on the Freedom Trail in Boston, and eventually I went to the graduate school at University of Vermont, and I specialized in Vermont during the Revolution. I have spent the past 20 years teaching in history and nonprofit education settings in schools, museums, and outdoor classrooms. I've also spent some time being a student in outdoor classrooms, like this teaching archaeological dig in England. That's a piece of medieval pottery I just found. I am a social cultural historian, which means that I focus on stories of how the Revolution was shaped by and affected everyday people, not so much on military battle tactics. And when I became the director of the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum in 2022, one of my first projects was to curate a new exhibit for the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. This turned into Voices of the Revolution, War on the Northern Frontier. It's located on the other side of this wall. If you haven't had a chance yet, you can take a look after this presentation. And in this exhibit, the museum partnered with 11 local artists to depict untold stories of the Revolution, how it affected people, and how they participated in it. All of the people featured in the exhibit are associated with this historical site here at the Ethan Allen Homestead. So last year, on the 250th anniversary of the start of the Revolution, the exhibit premiered, open to the public. And this year, our monthly lecture series is digging deeper into these stories. This is the first of 7 months of monthly lectures here at the Homestead that will focus on the individual people in this exhibit. For example, next month, you'll hear about William Marsh. He's the one in the top right wearing the tricorner hat. He is one of 2 men featured in the exhibit who served both the British and the American armies over the course of the war. So you'll want to come back to learn about him next month, but then the next 7 months to learn about all the rest of them too. Now, I knew when planning the exhibit that I wanted to feature a diverse group of people, and that includes women. And that meant I was going to have to dig pretty deep to find some women and their stories. In museum records, I had read of a man named Felix Powell who had owned this land prior to Ethan Allen. Felix Powell had farmed this land even. So I started wondering who else was in Felix Powell's family. Was there maybe a woman that I could feature? Did he have a wife? Did he have a daughter? So I quickly found out, just by a Google search, that Felix Powell was not just one of the men who owned this site before Ethan Allen. He was actually known as the first settler in Burlington. And on the screen are some of the historical references. The oldest reference I could find, where I think everyone else is quoting, is from 1886, The History of Chittenden County by William S. Rand, in which it's written, the first settler in Burlington was Felix Powell, who came here in 1773. And if you go to the Preservation Burlington's website today, you'll see the section on Apple Tree Point that says that's the very beginning of colonial settlement of Burlington in 1773, where Felix Powell came from Dorset, cleared a 5-acre piece of land, and built a log cabin. And the Apple Tree Bay Historical Society, which their website looks like it was active till about 10 years ago, has a couple of posts about Felix Powell, which they describe him as a Revolutionary War soldier, was the first to settle in Burlington, and built a log house on Apple Tree Point. Have you noticed a similarity in all these accounts? It's as if he came here by himself, he farmed the land by himself, he built the log cabin by himself, and he lived in it by himself. And I find that suspiciously hard to believe. Felix actually has a historical marker giving him all the credit to these firsts. This plaque sits on the banks of Lake Champlain on Apple Tree Point in Burlington. It's about 2 miles from this location. And it reads, Felix Powell, a Revolutionary War soldier, was the first settler in Burlington. Coming from Dorset in 1773, he cleared land and built a house on Apple Tree Point. And according to local historian Bob Blanchard on his Burlington area history Facebook group, which there probably are some members in the audience who are part of that group, Bob Blanchard wrote on there that the dedication of this plaque in 1923 was part of a 3-day-long festival featuring many events, including pageants, fireworks, and speeches marking Burlington's 150th anniversary. Then Vice President Calvin Coolidge addressed the crowd of 15,000 people at Battery Park, where a poem about Felix Powell was read. And other people spoke about Ira Allen as well. The culmination of that 3-day festival was a historical pageant with 1,000 costumed citizens of Burlington, acting out important events in the city's history. Like the other sources I've mentioned so far, this plaque mentions only Felix as the first settler. Only Felix got a poem about him. And I'm still searching for a copy of that poem, by the way. If anyone finds it, let me know. It was only Felix who cleared the land. It was only Felix who built the house. But was that true? And how could I find out about his wife if he even had one? So at this point, I need to introduce you to 2 of my assistants on the project. These are 2 student interns who helped me with the research. On the left is Andy Chestnut. Andy interned here at the Homestead Museum the summer of 2024 while he was enrolled in a graduate program in applied history with Shippensburg University. Andy was the first person to dive into this topic with me, and Andy made the first breakthrough when he found one reference to a Mrs. Powell and numerous references to a son. So therefore, there was more than just Felix probably here in 1773. Unfortunately, summer ended before Andy was able to find out more about Mrs. Powell, but I am greatly indebted to Andy for the vast bibliography of research sources about the Powell family, which told me where to look next. On the right is Maddie Baum. Maddie was an undergraduate student at the University of Vermont when she interned here fall of 2024. I mentioned this project to Maddie in passing. She was a collections intern, so she was mostly working with artifacts, actually. But I mentioned this project in passing, and with the vigor of a self-proclaimed feminist, she declared she was determined to find Mrs. Powell's identity. And she did. Maddie was able to match the Mrs. Powell mentioned in this one historical reference to online genealogical records that matched what we knew from other military records about the Powell family by now. And that allowed us to find out Mrs. Powell's name, Martha, and her maiden name, Winslow. And those were the keys to then find out more about her life. So while working with Maddie, I offered her my tips on researching women in history, which I will now share with you. Tip number 1, follow their men. Women were legal property of their husbands and their fathers until about the mid to late 1800s in the British American world. So therefore, all of their legal dealings were recorded only under the men's names. Also, most wives live with their husbands. Most daughters live with their fathers. So if you can follow their men, you're most likely able to track where the women lived as well. Of course, that's not always the case, but it is true in most cases, and you can look further into the wording about the men to determine if maybe their families were there too. So for example, in the case of Felix and Martha Powell, the 1774 land deed of Felix purchasing the Burlington property refers to Powell as being of Burlington. That was his permanent residence, according to this land deed. Now, sometimes young men did move ahead of their families to clear the land, get it ready before their families joined them. However, if it's in this land deed, it's written that of Burlington, this is his permanent residence, his family's most likely here too then. Otherwise, they would have still said of Pittsford or of Dorset, the town they last were living. Now, before moving to Burlington, Felix did live in Pittsford, Vermont, so that is where we looked first, and that gets me to tip number 2. Check out the local histories. And these local history publications include stories that you're not going to find in like the legal records of the towns. They are full of oral histories that then got written down. And in New England states and in New York, most towns or counties had a local history publication that was written in either the mid to late 19th century or the very early 20th century. That means they're writing down stories from people who either still lived the Revolution and they're now older, or they were their fathers or grandparents. So there's a lot closer connection to when these events actually happen. In the case of, also most of these town histories are available to read for free online at archive.org. So in the case of the Powells, we looked at Pittsford, Vermont, since that's where they lived before Burlington. And we have the 1872 publication, The History of the Town of Pittsford, Vermont. And in it, we found the following story from September 1777, which is the middle of the Saratoga campaign for the Revolutionary War historians here. This is when many patriot towns were being raided as the British Army marched south from Canada towards the Hudson River. And the story says, "The house of Felix Powell was attacked in the night. Mr. Powell was absent, but Mrs. Powell, apprehending an attack, had fled into a thick cluster of bushes in the vicinity. And while there, the house was plundered and burnt. In full view of the burning residence, she was delivered of a child before morning." I know, right? So this is the story that Andy Chestnut found summer of 2024 that is the only historical record we can find of a Mrs. Powell. But we weren't able to find her name yet, so we had to keep digging. So tip number 3 is to utilize genealogical research. There are so many amazing compilations of records available online, particularly with FamilySearch.org, Ancestry.com, FindAgrave.com. Now, these websites often have linked census records, birth records, marriage records, church, pension applications, and other military records, all digitized in one easy-to-access location. There is a lot of crowdsourced data in there, which means it might not be accurate, but it gives you a place to start, and then you just check the primary sources that are there in these data sources to check if the other crowdsourced information is correct or not. Or you might find that there's a lack of record related to what someone else has posted. But it gives you a really good place to start and access all of these different records. So through FamilySearch.org, my intern Maddie found the correct Powell family, was able to confirm this by the associated military records that Andy had found for Felix Powell. And there, Felix Powell was listed as married to a Martha Winslow. So we found her name, we found her ancestors, we found her marriage record, and more. Pictured here is their marriage record by the town clerk of Gloucester, Massachusetts, where they got married. Yeah, so he went by Felix, but his first name was John, and then their son's name is going to be Felix John, who also went by Felix. They liked repeating names back then.
She was pretty old when she
And-
had that baby, wasn't she?
Yes, she's gonna have a couple more too.
Or she was really young when she married.
Okay, so tip number 4 is also to research the generalities. So unless you get really, really lucky and you have a female historical figure that left a journal, a diary, or was a prolific writer and somebody saved all their writings, the closest you're probably ever going to get to really understanding their lives is to research what lives were like in general for women of that time, as well as what lives were like in general in the towns they lived in. So, for example, Laura Thatcher Ulrich is one of the most prominent women historians of this time, and from her we learned that women were often deeply involved in their husbands' trades, so much so that Ulrich dubs them deputy husbands, or those who were socially recognized as being able to make business decisions on behalf of their husbands when the latter were not around. From another leading women historian of this era, Karen Wolfe, we learned that women managed an economy somewhat separate from the male economy, consisting of mostly domestic labor, including farming, spinning, herbology, medicinal practices, teaching, sewing, and the production of household products like candles and soap and more. It is through studies like these that we look at trends amongst large groups of people that we can then make educated guesses about what Martha's life might have looked like. And tip number 5 is don't get discouraged. You need to remember this tip because you have to cast a really wide and deep net in order to glean just a few facts about these people who aren't in the obvious historical records. The plus side of this is that you'll learn a lot about the generalities, and you'll learn a lot about a whole community of people or multiple communities, which will give you many new potential research topics that you'll be interested in studying later and more interesting stories. But also, if you don't do this extra work to cast this wide and deep net, the only other option is leaving women out of the historical narrative completely. So don't get discouraged. So just a quick review, follow their men, check out the local town histories where a lot of the oral histories were written down, utilize genealogical research, research the generalities in the local communities, and don't get discouraged. So this was our methodology, and through that methodology, we came up with the following story of Martha's life. So who was Martha Winslow Powell? Martha was born on October 3rd, 1724 in Gloucester, Massachusetts. At the time of Martha's birth, Gloucester was rapidly changing from a small fishing port to a large maritime center. Just 9 years earlier, the New England schooner was invented in Gloucester, which expanded the reach of the town's fishing industry. The first piers were built in the harbor in the same decade Martha was born. And Gloucester was therefore starting to connect with trade routes to the Caribbean, England, and Africa. Pictured here is a house in Gloucester that was built just 4 years before Martha was born in the city. Well, the town. That house still stands today, by the way. Gloucester's Fishing Memorial commemorates the importance of fishing to the local economy for hundreds of years. And a sunset on a Gloucester beach is perhaps the same exact view Martha saw while growing up there. Martha was the second eldest of 7 known children, though her oldest sister, Sarah, died in infancy, so Martha effectively grew up as the eldest child. Her parents, Joseph Winslow and Sarah Winslow, née Day, named Martha after her parental grandmother, Martha Hawkins Robinson. Not much is yet known about Martha's childhood, but as the eldest child, and especially as the eldest daughter, we can assume she likely spent a lot of time helping to raise her younger siblings. We also know that Martha's family had deep roots in Massachusetts' North Shore. Her mother, like her, was born and raised in Gloucester. Her mother's father was also born and raised in Gloucester, but her maternal grandmother was from Manchester, England. On her father's side, Martha's family went back 3 generations in Salem, Massachusetts, another coastal town nearby. And yes, Martha's paternal grandparents did live in Salem during the infamous witch trials. Having grown up in a coastal town, Martha likely spent both productive and recreational time on the beaches, played in the surf, and was familiar with the shipping industry that fueled the local economy. Perhaps she even had her wedding on the beach in 1748 when she was 24 years old. On June 11th, 1748, Martha married John Felix Powell from Boston, who went by his middle name, Felix. They welcomed their first child, a girl named Sarah, on Christmas Day later that year. And if you do the math, that's 6 months. That may explain the next sentence. Sadly, Sarah passed away on the same day she was born. Unfortunately, this was also not going to be the last time Martha lost a child so tragically. Sometime after the passing of baby Sarah, the Powells moved away from Martha's family and away from the ocean that she grew up on. And by 1759, Martha was living in Canaan, Connecticut, over 100 miles inland from the sea. And according to my research, Martha never made it back to the ocean. I know that Martha and Felix lived in Canaan in 1759 because there's a land purchase record dated February 3rd, 1759, that states, here's a quote, "I, Edward Owen of Simsbury, in Hartford County, Colony of Connecticut, in New England, for ye consideration of the sum of 30 pounds lawful money to me, in hand, paid by Felix Powell of Canaan, in Litchfield County of Colony aforesaid." The land that the Powells purchased in this land deed was 10 miles north in Sheffield, Massachusetts, and we know that they moved to Sheffield, Massachusetts, because their first reference in Vermont town records is that they are from Massachusetts. The Powells did not stay long in Sheffield, Massachusetts, however. By 1762, they were living in Argyle, New York, just 30 miles west of Manchester, Vermont, so quite far further north. There, Martha gave birth to Felix John Powell Jr. We know they lived in Argyle at this time because of Felix Jr.'s later pension record that lists this as his birthplace. Both Felix's, senior and junior, are also recorded in this area after the Revolutionary War as well. So that's how we know they moved up there. By 1768, Martha's family moved to Dorset, Vermont, where her husband Felix is once again credited with being the first settler, even though she probably was there too. 2 years later, in 1770, they moved to Pittsford, Vermont, and there Martha gave birth to the first white baby in the town, a daughter who sadly died right after birth. The fact that Martha is there in 1770 in Pittsford is further evidence that she likely was there every time Felix moved. 3 years later, after the death of that child, they moved to Burlington in northern Vermont. Martha and Felix moved numerous times in the 1750s through the 1770s, prompted primarily by an economic venture known as land speculation. In brief, land speculation is the practice of purchasing large tracts of land, numerous tracts of land, waiting for property values to rise, and then selling the land later at a profit. Over the next couple decades, Martha and Felix purchased many pieces of land for the purpose of later selling them at a profit. It didn't work out for them like many land speculators in New England, but we'll get to that part. Now, since female land ownership in the 18th century was greatly restricted, the Powell family land deeds show only Martha's husband's name, Felix Powell. Her name's not on the land deeds. However, if you can look beyond the legal definition and into the practical relationship between a landowner and their land, farming the land, building and maintaining a home on the land, living there, contributing to the economic capital that purchased the land, and living in a community that socially accepts the land as yours, it is fair to attribute ownership of the land to Martha as well. Legally, women's ability to own land was greatly restricted by paternalistic and sexist 18th century English laws. However, social and cultural view of ownership versus just the legal view of ownership, gave many women dominion over their land on which they lived and worked. And for that reason, and for the sake of simplicity and communication, this presentation and in my speech, when I talk about her, I attribute the land ownership to Martha herself, despite only Felix's name on the land deeds. She owned it too. Now, British settlers such as Martha were particularly tempted into land speculation after the British victory over the French in the French and Indian War ended in 1763. Now, these lands up here in Vermont were part of the indigenous Abenaki homelands for thousands of years, and they had not been colonized in great numbers by British settlers before the French and Indian War because of, well, the French and the Indians that were here. The indigenous presence and their nearby French-Canadian allies kept British settlers away. However, the British victory in 1763 forced the evacuation of French troops from Canada, and the Abenakis lost their allies. Therefore, this made the Abenaki homelands easier for British settlers to come up and claim. So starting in the 1760s, British Americans finally envisioned a future for themselves up in present-day Vermont. Martha and Felix's land speculation was threatened, however, by an argument brewing between New York and what was soon to be called Vermont. In the 1750s and 1760s, the colony of New Hampshire sold land grants in what is present-day Vermont. But in the however, New York governor believed that New York owned all of what is now Vermont, not New Hampshire. And the British king sided with New York when the issue was brought before him. So all of a sudden, everyone who had bought their land from New Hampshire, including Martha and her husband Felix, were under the jurisdiction of New York and had to pay New York an extra fee to get their land deeds recognized by New York. Many people were not happy about paying this fee, but more importantly, they believed New York had falsely represented the issue to the king, so they boycotted the fee. Now, despite having already moved to their land, farmed the fields, constructed homes, birthed and raised children, New York threatened to evict families like the Powells from their farms. So the Green Mountain Boys militia group was formed at this time to protect the holders of land titles that were purchased through New Hampshire. Pictured here is an 1842 woodcut depicting an altercation between Yorkers and Green Mountain Boys that happened in 1774. Now, Martha's husband Felix did not join the Green Mountain Boys when it was first formed in 1770, perhaps because he was 50 years old at that time, whereas, to put in reference, Ethan Allen, the group's leader, was 32 years old. Their son was only 8 years old in 1770, but he did later join the Green Mountain Boys when he came of age. Martha and her family's economic success, along with that of many other settlers in what was becoming known as Vermont, depended on Vermont's successful resistance against New York claims in the Green Mountains, and later depended on the outcome of the American Revolution as well. In both, they would eventually become successful, but only after many years of struggle and strife. Despite the threats from New York, Martha's family stayed in the New Hampshire grants, or present-day Vermont, and purchased even more property here. They moved to Burlington in northern Vermont in 1773, and then they purchased the property they lived on in Burlington in 1774. Yes, they kind of did the squatters' rights tactic a few times. When they arrived in what is now known as the New North End of Burlington, which is oddly named since it was the oldest part of the city that was settled, but the New North End of Burlington, there were fields along the Winooski River that had already been cleared by Abenaki farmers hundreds of years ago. Early French explorers, in fact, documented Abenaki cornfields along the Winooski Intervale as early as the early 1600s. But for late 18th century settlers, like Martha and her family, they were still required by their land deeds to continue clearing down trees and clearing boulders out of the fields to increase their acreage for farming and development. This is what the British called improving their lands. If they didn't improve enough lands each year, their land deed could actually become null and void. So Martha and Felix built their home on Apple Tree Point, which is about 2 miles west of where we are today. They owned more than just that parcel of land, however. In a deposition from an early 19th century legal dispute, it is recorded that Ira Allen conveyed to Felix Powell in 1774 194.5 acres, now included in Lot 31 and upper half of Lot 33. That's where we're standing today. And that Powell entered and made improvements upon the land. So from that document, we know that Martha and Felix farmed the land right here, or at least cleared boulders. So likely either Martha and Felix farmed it themselves, or because they were they were getting to be about 50-something years old. They may have hired or hired laborers, or even perhaps borrowed enslaved laborers if there were some around to help clear the future farmlands. So Martha and Felix's early days in Burlington are recorded in the earliest survey records of this area, which is a journal kept by Ira Allen that covers 1772 to 1773. Ira Allen was only 21 years old when he traveled to Burlington to survey this land for his family's land speculation company called the Onion River Land Company. In addition to the land survey records, this journal also includes random transactions, and they're not in chronological order. So it's like he just used up any extra scratch paper in there. So one transaction recorded is on November 10th, 1773. It says, Felix Powell, 1 pocket compass for 3 shillings, 250 light penny nails, 2 orders of beef, cash for 1 pound, 2 shillings, 6 pence, 1 pocket compass worth 3 shillings, and 11 days works of sleeper. While the compass might have been solely for Felix, the beef most assuredly went to Martha. She likely also interacted with those horse penny nails for the general construction around their primitive homestead. So we're seeing here a shopping list that maybe Martha ordered her husband to go out and buy. One thing of note is that the mark on the far right under the year, this is mentioned in a few accounts you might read about Felix Powell. Most of the accounts on if you find him in Google will say, where they'll list him as Dr. Felix Powell, because it almost looks like under the year 1773, there's a flourish that maybe could be interpreted as a DR. However, nowhere else in any historical records of any towns is Felix referred to as a doctor, and when I sat in and looked through the journal myself, I saw that flourish written in the top right corner of a numerous transactions. I believe that is something Ira Allen did to organize the transactions himself, like some kind of check mark or something. I don't think it had anything to do with Felix himself. Another thing you might notice is the 11 workdays of sleeper on Felix's bill. What's that? I'm not sure. But sleeper does show up 2 other times in Ira Allen's journal, in entries that are not very far from this entry. So for example, on July 18th of 1773, it's written, then came Cross and Sleeper to work for the Onion River Company. There were numerous entries of other people who came to work for the company. And on October 25th and 26th, Sleeper lost. This is all the more confusing since Sleeper worked for Felix Powell for 11 days on a transaction recorded 15 days after Sleeper was apparently lost. I could not figure out the mystery of who Sleeper was, but if we could, it could help us figure out more of Martha and Felix's story. Was Sleeper a hired laborer? Was Sleeper an enslaved man that they borrowed and paid his enslaver? Was Sleeper a horse or an oxen? I'm not sure. It's a mystery at this point. Martha's husband, Felix, is mentioned in one other part of Ira's journal. It's an undated entry that states, when Powell went to mill, he had 2 half-joes and 1 pistol. I have had $10. It is believed that at the time the closest mill was in Otter Creek, about 50 miles south, which was likely a 4-day trip on horseback. So did Martha join him? Or did she stay in Burlington, perhaps smoke that beef that she just got an order from Ira Allen? Who knows? If she stayed on the farm, we can take a few educated guesses about what type of work she would have done. She would have had many responsibilities pertaining to the maintenance of the family home. They would have varied day to day and season to season. But she would have been responsible for what we historians call that time period was women's work. It was primarily cleaning, preparing food, maintaining a fruitful and plentiful garden, making textiles for clothing, dyeing textiles, creating soap and candles, and other traditional household labor like sweeping, dusting, laundry, and childcare. This was all before electrical implements could assist the work. For example, doing a household's laundry would take a full day or more. Baking would take a full day or more. That's all you'd get done in a whole day. Additionally, Martha would have been in charge of her family's finances and compensating any people who worked for them or even maybe lived with them. It was traditionally women who kept the domestic financial accounts and made decisions regarding their household spending. Lastly, women were also expected to fill in for their husband's skilled labor whenever needed, so many women were trained to some degree on their spouse's occupation. It is unknown what occupation Martha's husband Felix may have had other than farming and moving to new frontier towns every few years, but it is likely that Martha had a decent working knowledge of whatever trades he may have had. And as you can see from all of this, the traditional English couplet is true: women's work is never done. Keeps going. Now, the budding American Revolutionary War escalated into open rebellion against Great Britain with the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, which is just 2 years after Martha moved to Burlington. Further, the Green Mountain Boys brought the war right to the Champlain Valley when they captured Fort Ticonderoga on May 10th of that year. As the war escalated, military activity in the region surrounding Lake Champlain increased. So for their own safety, Martha's family fled their Burlington lands along with virtually every other British settler here in 1776. Seeking safety further south, the Powells moved to Manchester, Vermont. There, the following year, the Powell family sold provisions to the American militias to feed Vermont soldiers. And Martha's husband, Felix, also served on the local Committee of Safety, one of many provisional government bodies that gradually replaced loyalist colonial authorities during the early years of the Revolutionary War. Now, only men were allowed to serve on the Committee of Safety, so Martha was prohibited, but we don't know how many conversations they may have had or advisement she may have given him on the issues in their home. The Powells appeared to have generated little, if any, profit from their land speculation venture in Burlington. They sold the future Ethan Allen Homestead lots along the Winooski River to a man named William Marsh for settlement of debts on March 25th of 1777. And the next year, they sold their Apple Tree Point lots in Burlington to a James Murdoch of Saybrook, Connecticut for only 190 pounds. Now, although their economic plans were stifled by the war, when they disposed of their last Burlington lands, the Powell family generated an historically significant document. This is the first known land deed to declare that the land that it transferred laid within the jurisdiction of the new state of Vermont. Vermont had just declared itself an independent state in January of 1777, and this was the very first known official land transfer that recognized that the land was in Vermont, not New Hampshire, and definitely not New York. Now, during the colonial era, especially in frontier regions, able-bodied white men were required to perform military service. And Vermont payrolls record that Martha sent both her husband and her son to fight in the Revolution. In August of 77, both husband and son served 3 days under the service of Nathan Smith in an unspecified action against Tories. And shortly after, Martha's son Felix Jr. enlisted in Warner's Regiment, more commonly known today as the Green Mountain Boys, on September 17th of 1777. He was just 16 years old when he enlisted, and eventually he transferred to a Connecticut troop where he served until the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, where he was finally discharged at West Point. According to his 1820 pension application, Felix Jr. said that he was in the battle at Bennington, was at Valentine's Hill and the Battle of Horseneck, that he served his country faithfully for 6 years and was in 14 different battles and skirmishes. Now, over these 6 years, Martha likely received minimal correspondence from her son. She didn't know if he was safe, injured, or even dead. During the Revolutionary War, many people went months without word of their loved ones. Martha was unable to see her boy grow from a young man of 16 to a young man of 22. Now, Martha's husband went on to serve another 2 months in 1777, 2 weeks in 78, and 1 week in 79. Although Felix Sr. clearly supported the revolution, his age simply wouldn't allow him more military service, we assume. During 1777, he was 54 years old, which is 4 years older than the cutoff for mandatory service at the age of 50. During her husband's deployment, Martha was in her 50s herself, but she had not only to worry about her young son and her husband, in addition to her other responsibilities, she still had to keep the farm going. During this time, Martha was unable to join her family on the military field since she was not a man, but she served the war by taking care of the family's home and land as best as she could. Now, being in charge of the home front did not mean that Martha was out of danger. In March of 1777, a group of 13 Tories traveled through Pittsford and were then chased and captured by Patriot forces. Oh, they'd moved to Pittsford by now. I forgot to tell you that part. The Battle of Hubbardton was just 10 miles from Martha's home. Many of the Patriots retreated from the Battle of Hubbardton into Pittsford, where Martha lived. The proximity of the battle inspired Pittsford residents to construct Fort Mott, which consisted of a blockhouse in the center of town with a 3/4-acre picket fence and hemlock walls. The fort served as a rallying point for residents because of the numerous raids that were conducted in the area by British allied indigenous warriors. These raids regularly attacked Vermonters from 1777 until the war's end in 1783, and they often resulted in the slaughter of livestock, property damage, and the scalping, kidnapping, and murders of civilian men, women, and children. In 1777, British leader Burgoyne wrote that he would, quote, give stretch to the Indian forces to wreak havoc amongst the Americans. So he was turning a blind eye. In September of 1777, Martha's home was subject to one such raid. Although we will never know what alerted her, we know that Martha was able to escape her home in time to hide in the nearby woods. Martha was pregnant during this raid, and she watched her family's home looted and robbed. After the raiders ransacked her home, they lit it on fire. The local history stories claim that while hiding in the woods, lit by her burning home, Martha went into labor. She gave birth alone, on the forest ground, and couldn't risk making any noise in case it alerted any lingering raiders. By the time of sunrise, Martha had successfully delivered her baby. But this babe, like many others Martha gave birth to, did not survive. In the same month that Martha's home was attacked, 2 other raids occurred in Pittsford, resulting in the kidnapping, scalping, and murder of 4 people. It is not an overestimate to say that hiding in the woods saved Martha's life. The attacks continued. In November of 79, a multi-day attack on Pittsford resulted in multiple burned homes, 12 Americans captured, and the muster of 400 American militiamen. The next year, they built another fort in Pittsford, and just after its construction, an American soldier was found there shot and scalped, so the Americans named it Fort Vengeance. A monument now sits on the fort, which is pictured here. In July 1780, a contingent of indigenous warriors canoed up Otter Creek from Lake Champlain, and they beached on the banks of Pittsford. They kidnapped a local man named Isaac Matson and transported him to Canada. These attacks did not stop until the peace treaty was signed in 1783, which eventually ended the Revolutionary War. And I've just given you some of the examples from one town in Vermont. That was going on throughout all of Vermont. Pictured here is a piece of art made by local artist Ekaterina Sinkova. In her artist statement, Sinkova states that in this depressing light, Martha is drawn set apart from all of her surroundings. She's in the woods with few trees, a colorful sky, and she's detached from everything, thus the black and white compared to her surroundings. This depiction of Martha is a representation of how little women have been taken seriously throughout history, even when women are essential to society. She is depicted in such a light that shows a woman suffering in her societally assigned role, a role that is not often understood and often silenced. She is a rare documentation of a woman suffering, and these things aren't represented enough. It is only because her story is so dramatic that history even noticed her at all and set her apart from others. I didn't mention this artist was a high schooler when she made this piece as well. She was one of our up-and-coming artists that we hired for the work, for the exhibit. Now, Martha did not survive to see the end of the war. 3 years after her harrowing escape into the woods and the loss of her newborn child, in October of 1780, Martha's father wrote a new will in which he gave the remainder of my estate to my daughter Sarah Hales, to my daughter Mary Stevens, to my daughter Hannah Presley, and to my grandchildren born of Martha Powell, deceased. So Martha died sometime between her 53rd and 56th year of age. We do not know the cause of her death. Was she a victim of one of the many raids in Pittsford that continued on? Did the dangers of childbirth at her advanced age of 50 plus finally have mortal effects on her? Unlike Martha, her husband Felix did see the end of the war. Felix was still alive in 1799, but, quote, very poor. And because he, quote, moved once or twice, again after the war, he was hard to find by the men who were looking for him for a legal deed issue for this very plot of land that we're standing on. Felix was 77 years old in 1799 when Jabez Penniman, who married Ethan's widow Fanny, those of you who are historians of this site, went looking for Felix. We do not know when Martha's husband Felix did die, but their son's pension record in 1818, this first pension record I've been able to find, does not list Felix Sr. as his dependent, so it's likely that Felix Sr. had died before 1818. As for Martha's son, Felix Jr., after probably growing up with tales of his mother's childhood of tall ships on the high seas, Felix Jr. grew up to be a ship's captain. Martha's life was certainly not an easy one. Through her life, the transitive nature of Revolutionary era Vermont is illustrated, especially for women, and especially for those like Martha and Felix who were just under the economic middle class. Over the course of 18 years, Martha undertook at least 7 resettlements across New England and upstate New York as her family pursued new land ownership opportunities. As the American Revolution escalated from 1775 to 1777, Martha had to flee her home. She suffered loss of property, loss of children's lives, and was exposed to danger personally. Rather than merely succumbing to the circumstances, Martha and her family directly involved themselves in the war. They struggled and fought for their interests and cast their lot with the New Hampshire grants and the new state of Vermont. Martha helped shape the Vermont we know today and helped secure its place as a sovereign state within the United States of America. Martha is one of the many founding people of our nation 250 years ago. The end. Let's go this way. So I do have time for some questions. I see a hand up already. Yeah, Ginger.
So, do we know the names of the children who lived to adulthood?
There's reference to the one in, I think it was Pittsford, where there was the first white child born.
Right.
That her name was Sarah.
Okay.
But then she didn't survive. I haven't found record of any others that lived to adulthood. The only reference is in her father's will that says grandchildren plural. Yeah. But I also just wonder if he just never got the news that some of them may not have lived, especially in the turmoil of the revolution. It'd be hard to get mail.
Son, right?
The one son that we know that lived to adulthood was Felix Jr.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
How many children did she have in all?
So she had the daughter in Gloucester that didn't survive. She had the daughter in Pittsford that didn't survive. She had the child in 1777 in Pittsford who didn't. So the 2 different times, and then the child that did survive. So 4 that I can think of off the top of my head that historical records know of. But she seemed to be pretty fruitful. So perhaps there were more, too, that didn't make it into the records. Yeah.
So, first of all, I applaud
thank
your
you.
scholarship, because this was really fascinating, both the process and the results, and I can't imagine how many hours you put into that, and it's really stunning.
Thank you,
And
Christine.
we're lucky to have you. Just a funny thing, what is a half-joe?
It was a type of coin, but I don't know any more beyond that.
You know, I went modern, I was thinking, oh, just like a half cup of coffee. You know?
Yeah.
It's half of a full Joe.
Instead of a full Joe,
Yeah.
it's like a half Joe.
It's half of a full Joe. That's clearly no.
Okay.
It was some kind of currency, but I don't know. Yeah.
When you mentioned the first white child,
Yeah.
what are the colors of the other children? Are they talking about?
It's to clarify from the indigenous peoples, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Betsy.
Did you, in all this, did you or the others learn any more about Felix Powell Jr.? Other than he went to sea, I guess.
Yeah, well, he did get married. He moved to upstate New York. I think he was a ship's captain on Lake Champlain, not in the Atlantic, because it seems like he stayed in upstate New York. He did apply for pension applications, and in the early 20th century, someone who claimed to be a descendant of him from Tacoma, Washington, sent in a request to access the pension applications, and her letter is now there, which I found interesting because I'm from Washington State. So I was like, maybe I'm related to Felix Powell somehow. Ooh. But there's probably more, but I didn't dig further into him. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the Powells being the first British settlers in Burlington. Were there French prior to them in Burlington?
Yeah, that's a good question. The caveat British is mostly there to acknowledge the indigenous people who lived here first, though the word settler itself kind of does that, but just to be clear about it, and that's why I sometimes don't use it and sometimes do. There were French land plots, like the land here was owned by different French people. It's a little unclear if any of them ever came here, but not a lot if they did and didn't stay permanently. There's really no permanent or effective like French settlement in the area, other than the forts on Lake Champlain.
I thought Colchester had one.
I've heard that too, but I haven't found any document to like back that up.
Addison County did, for sure.
Yeah.
Down the Chippewa Point area.
Yeah. Humans are humans. There's always going to be exceptions. But yeah.
So did they start out as Tories and then become part of the revolution?
It doesn't seem so. It seems that they were aligned with the independent Vermont cause the whole time. They purchased their land from people like Ira Allen and other people who were in the New Hampshire side of the issue. And it seems that like right away they joined the committees of safety. They joined, as soon as their son hit 16, the year he could, he joined the Green Mountain Boys. I don't see any indication that they wavered. Yeah.
So do we know that they hit 500 cleared acres or something? Do we have any idea if that included any of this land, or they were more likely over on Apple Tree Point?
Yeah, the reference I think that I've read was that there was about 5 acres cleared on Apple Tree Point, and that on these plots of land here along the Winooski River, improvements were made, and that's all that is said. So that means that they cleared some amount of land, but I don't know how much.
But we don't necessarily know that they lived right on this.
We know they lived at Apple Tree Point, that there was a log cabin there, yeah. Just based on the oral histories passed down.
And you referenced now before that they made improvements here, but there was already a lot of cleared land here from the Abneki, you said.
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there was already cleared land, but not all of it was cleared, yeah. And the Abenaki had primarily cleared the floodplain, so then it was land like up here, we're on a little bit of a hill above the floodplain. So this would have, for example, been an area that needed to be cleared. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the fight over the Vermont deeds between New Hampshire and New York.
Yeah.
Did Massachusetts ever figure into that battle?
It did, but very briefly. Massachusetts originally included Fort Drummer, which is in present-day Brattleboro. Am I getting that correct? Yes, Vermonters? Yeah, okay. Brattleboro and Bennington. Sometimes it's easy to flip my east and west. Okay, yeah. Okay, so so Massachusetts originally settled the area, and that was considered part of Massachusetts. So they created Fort Drummer down there. And then, but pretty early on, Massachusetts said, okay, I have no skin in the game. You can have it, New Hampshire and Vermont. However, when New York started becoming more of a, for lack of a better term, bully in the situation, Massachusetts did throw their lot back in again briefly to kind of just add on to this like New England weight for the New England side against New York. Yeah, and the U.S. Continental Congress basically said, let's let the people who are involved deal with it, and that's why Massachusetts said, okay, wait, then I'm involved. You know, let me weigh in on this subject. But it never really got settled until 1791, long after the war, when Vermont finally paid New York a fee to be independent. Yeah.
Getting back to the possibility of French settlement,
Yeah.
apparently the town of Vergennes was named for a French minister
Hmm.
who dealt with Benjamin Franklin. So it
Ooh.
would have been people from Quebec, I don't think.
Yeah, I think in Addison County,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, I don't know much about the French settlement in the area. All I know is that it wasn't
Well,
prominent.
yeah, I knew
Yeah.
the John Strong, from the John Strong mansion, the DAR
Mm.
piece of it, you know, that his family prior to the Revolutionary War, a bunch of
Yeah.
those people settled that area, but it was apparently in the cellar holes of the houses that were French people lived, and they were burned out by the native, by
Yeah,
somebody.
I wouldn't be surprised if
yeah.
any French settlers in the Champlain area left after they lost the French and Indian War, too.
And that cellar hole is still visible
Ooh.
there at the campground,
I think Ginger's offering tours if anyone wants to go see.
well, it is open, it's just on the weekends, the John Strong Mansion,
Great.
in the summer months, I forget, 11 to 3 or something like that, so.
Check their website, John Strong Mansion,
Well,
DAR
I've
house.
been there as a docent, but sort of an
Thanks, Ginger.
assistant one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I do want to be cognizant of the time. It's after 3 o'clock, and Margaret did put out an amazing amount of refreshments for you to enjoy and shop in the gift shop, purchase a membership at the front desk if you're not a member yet, and I will be sticking around for a bit more if anyone did have any more questions and wanted to talk. But thank you again so much.